Welcome into this edition of Making the Leap. It's an exciting one. It's a special one for us. We haven't spent an inordinate amount of time in the year and some change we've been doing shows talking about a subject that we know many of our friends, relatives, and many in this audience care a great deal about, the subject of homeschooling, or some have called it home educating. This guest today knows it like the back of his hand. It's been his forte. He has been in the space, and most importantly, he has been the leader, and this group has been the leading advocate group for the legal defense of those who homeschool or home educate. His name is Jim Mason, joins us today. Jim, welcome to Making the Leap.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here.
We're so glad to have you here. When I started reading about you and learning about your organization, just taking it back to the place of you helped create the homeschool world, you gave it a legal place. And that is tremendous to me when I look at the growth of how homeschooling has exploded, how it's changed, what it's become. And just to know that somebody is here who's, said, this is allowed. This is okay. This isn't a bad thing. I'm just so glad to have you with us.
How long was it founded, Jim, the Legal Defense Fund? What is it? And kind of explain its history, if you would.
So Homeschool Legal Defense Association was founded 40 years ago this year. Wow. And it was founded by two lawyers, Mike Ferris and Mike Smith, who themselves heard, so this is in homeschooling lore. In the late 70s, Dr. Raymond Moore appeared on Focus on the Family with Dr. James Dobson and started advocating that kids would be better off if they didn't go to formal schools, but were educated by their parents at home for a variety of educational reasons. And of course, Dr. Dobson then started calling Dr. Moore the father of the modern homeschooling movement. Well, that broadcast was heard by many of the pioneers in the homeschooling movement, including our founders, Mike Ferris and Mike Smith. Mike Smith was an attorney in Los Angeles. Mike Ferris was an attorney in Washington State. Right. They both decided to start homeschooling themselves in the late 70s, early 80s, when it was thought to be illegal everywhere, actually was illegal in many places. And so as the very beginning of the homeschooling movement started, these guys, because they were attorneys who were homeschooling, started getting a lot of phone calls from others. So then Mike Ferris, Mike Smith credits Mike Ferris with the idea that this is going to be big. The homeschooling movement that was just beginning, it's going to be big. And so he said, we have to stand together. We can't have isolated families out there fighting the system. And so they founded HSLDA in 1983, and it's a kind of a membership association where we'll come in. For 40 years, we have now almost 100,000 member families, and if the state comes after a homeschooling family, we'll help them in the courts, and then we do a lot of work in the legislatures.
That's one of the first things I want to know, and I think every homeschool or someone who's entertaining homeschooling should know and understand the legalities of it today. I've got 1,000 questions for you, so I hope you're ready.
I have a few, so I'll try to.
Let me first ask broadly. You said in many places it was illegal 40 plus years ago. Today, where does it stand in terms of its legality? Is there anywhere in the United States it's illegal to homeschool?
Yeah. So if 40 years ago you had asked the Attorney General of any of the 50 states, you would have had an almost universal, it's illegal. Wow. Some of those people would have been wrong, it turns out.
Just 40 years ago. That's not that long ago.
That's not that long ago.
Right.
And today, it's universally understood that it is not just legal, but it's almost a mainstream option compared to what it was even 20 years ago, and it was still kind of considered to be
What was the original justification for calling it illegal, just out of my curiosity?
So one of the first big legal battles all across the country, compulsory attendance laws say kids have to be in school if they're of a certain age. And then there might, there might be some exceptions, but most of those required that that the child had to be taught by certified teachers. So if you were not a certified teacher and you were trying to homeschool your kids, many states would prosecute. And a lot of the landmark legal decisions in the Supreme Court of Texas, for example, or in the Supreme Court of Michigan, or in the Supreme Court of Iowa, all involve people who were prosecuted for homeschooling without a license.
Prosecuted. And was that, as you look back on it today, was it truly legal, legislative, or was it political, as we see it today?
So Texas provides a really interesting example because in the 90s, lots of people were getting prosecuted for teaching without a license. And
That's stunning.
I know, and I feel like that's not
the
super
90s
long ago.
was a blink ago. People were being prosecuted for
being
that.
prosecuted. And so a number of people sued, and HSLDA was a part of this lawsuit, for the proposition that the private school law in Texas allowed parents to teach their own kids, that the actual wording of the statute didn't require that parents have a teaching license to homeschool. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court of Texas. And so all of those prosecutions were not correct. It was always legal.
Okay.
But until that case in the Supreme Court, it's a famous case, the Leeper case in 1994, held that the statute always permitted homeschooling. The biggest case I worked on in my tenure at HSLDA was in California, and it was the same thing, where Mike Smith started homeschooling in the late 70s in California under the private school statute, which by its plain words does not prohibit parents from teaching their own kids. But the state took the position that you had to be certified. So years went by, and it kind of became an accepted practice, but the bureaucracy in California, the education bureaucracy, never really accepted it. And every once in a while, they'd kind of rattle the chains and threaten to do something about it. So it was kind of always a little bit dicey in California. Then in 2008, in a juvenile court case that was confidential, that nobody knew about because it was a juvenile court case, the Court of Appeals in Los Angeles came out with an opinion, I'll never forget it, August 28th, 2008, that said that homeschooling in California is illegal and always has been. And this was after thousands and thousands of people were homeschooling. So we got involved in that case right away as soon as it became public, and asked the court to reconsider based on things that we knew about the statutes that weren't presented to them beforehand. And by August, that same three judges in Los Angeles who had said homeschooling in California is illegal unless you have a teaching license, reversed themselves and said, indeed, homeschooling in California is a species of private school education, which is what we'd argued all along.
Sure.
And so that was the last big teacher certification case in America.
You got a lower court to reverse itself.
The same three judges.
The same three.
That doesn't happen much
It doesn't happen very often. It was kind of so it was really exciting from a lawyer
I
standpoint.
can't imagine.
Because we didn't represent the family in the juvenile court case. And we knew the answer to the question that wasn't ever presented to the court properly. And so we had 15 days to file something with the court to ask them to reconsider. And so there was a lot of, I've written a lot about this case. There was a lot of legal stuff happening in the background that got to the point of us being able to file a petition for rehearing, which we were told by many, many knowledgeable lawyers in California, and this is true. Petitions for rehearing are rarely granted.
Okay.
But that was the first opportunity to remedy the situation. And so Mike Ferris and I wrote the petition for rehearing and got it filed just in the nick of time. And within less than a week, the court granted the petition, which in California means that it was vacated. It didn't exist. The bad opinion, went out the window. And then they permitted full briefing on the merits. And I mean, I can go on forever. So there were, members of we organized amicus briefs from members of Congress, and the governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, came in on our side. The attorney general.
This was not that long ago.
No, it's 15 years. Like, that's what I can't, that's amazing to me.
Jerry Brown was the attorney general. Arnold Schwarzenegger was the governor, and they wrote a brief in support of our position. So we had the Terminator and the Moonbeam on our side.
Right, two diametrically opposed
Right.
political figures at that time.
that we're
Right.
still there.
Right.
Well, and that's
Did it ever?
okay.
And I'm sorry,
No, it's okay.
I'm
No, I know
fascinated
there's
by
a
the
lot. Yeah,
history, and I want to set the table in the history before we go forward on a lot of contemporary issues too.
No, it's- yeah.
Did it ever make its way to the Supreme Court? Did the Supreme Court ever rule on homeschooling, or did it never needed to get that far?
So education in America is mostly a state issue.
Okay.
Excuse me.
And so we have had some cases in federal courts that have sort of a crossover into federal law, but homeschooling itself has not made it to the federal Supreme Court. But we've had lots of cases in state Supreme Courts.
And that's for the benefit of everybody, I would assume, to keep it at a state issue rather than make it something that is, I mean, I know it's hard for people when they're moving from state to state or when you want information or answers, and what they're doing in Virginia is not the same as what they're doing in Illinois, and that makes it hard. But it's beneficial, I would think, to keep it state level.
When you think about the Department of Education federally,
Right, and you want to get rid of
that's only been around since 1977. I mean, that's a fairly new concept itself. I kind of reject. I mean, if I'm to be honest, if you say what's the first thing you get rid of in
wanna get
Washington
rid of that,
D.C.,
yeah.
that's the one, is it not?
Yeah. So I've written this, and I think it's true. You know, the Jimmy Carter created the Department of Education. It was during his presidency, and he appointed the first Secretary of Education in the late 70s, which was about the same time that Focus on the Family and Dr. Raymond Moore started this fire that became the homeschooling
That's actually
movement.
what I think is very fascinating.
So now
that
think
one
of-
was happening.
Was that on purpose?
Now, you think about that. But think about that. Which has proven to be more successful since the late 70s?
Right.
The education department in Washington, D.C., dictating to all the public schools in America how they should behave, or the homeschooling movement.
That was my
Yes.
question. Was that on purpose? Was that a countermeasure? Because
Or maybe it was just the timing of what was.
Yeah, what I know about in this last year is the Washington Post has been white hot on. In fact, I remember sitting down and reading about Mr. Ferris specifically, and I'm sure you are familiar with the piece. It was an extensive Washington Post profile on this shadowy figure called Mike Ferris, who's been the big money and the big advocate behind this sinister homeschool movement for decades. And they talked about him like he was Dr. Evil or something.
Right.
But now that I hear you tell this story, it makes me wonder, did the Carter administration sense that coming, or were those just two interests converging at the same time?
I think it was the latter,
Okay.
because education had been a part of health education and welfare department. And so every president, in my lifetime comes into office saying, I'm going to fix education.
Yes. Yes.
They come at it differently, but Carter's solution was take it out of this, multi-alphabet soup department, health education and welfare, and let's give it its own secretary. Let's elevate education to where it belongs. I think
Purporting
that's what
it to be something positive and good, obviously,
Right.
where
Yeah.
instead
Correct.
it has created massive problems.
But the social
nationwide.
movements of the time, I mean, the currents in in society at the time did give birth to the homeschooling movement as public education became more and more secular and more a tool of, sort of top-down management and more ideological. That's what prompted a lot of people in the early days to begin homeschooling, is that the public schools no longer would support things they believed in. That's especially true of Christians.
I think it's fascinating just the timing of everything. That 2008 year sticks out because I had just finished teaching at that point and staying home with my kids from then on. And I only came across 2 homeschooling families in my time as a public school teacher. But since that point of staying home, church, that, I watched it just explode. And so I find that interesting. We were nowhere near California, but
No.
I just think about, wow, that 2 families and all my families that came through, 2 were homeschooling. And now I look around and it's, well, just in church this weekend, I was looking at this section that we were sitting in, and almost every pew in front of us had somebody either homeschooling or private school. Now, there were a lot of public school around, but it was just in our area, my view of church. And I just thought, that's fascinating, that what a shift it has become.
It is so important to know this history because it's really short. It's a short history,
Right.
And it has exploded post-COVID, as you understand and know. I would guess, you having been in this space for decades, have you seen anything like we've seen in the explosion of homeschooling, home educating in these last 3 years or so?
No, I honestly no. And it's really a testament to the early folks because in the early days, back when Mike Ferris and Mike Smith were homeschooling, families had to really endure legal peril and social stigma.
I was just going to say.
It wasn't easy in those early days often. And, in some places it was harder than others. And not to mention, there were so few homeschoolers. So you mentioned, your experience. Well, back in the 80s, it was difficult to, for homeschoolers to connect. Mark Zuckerberg, I don't think had even been born yet. So, there were no Facebook groups. There was nothing.
No, and there is such an amazing amount of resources now that I think that is the other obstacle is that you don't even sometimes know where to start because there's too much information. Whereas, back late 70s, early 80s, where do you start? Because you don't have that network. And what I don't know what the word is, the dichotomy or the opposition there. That's fascinating to me.
Well, yeah, since the last 3 years, and Christine and I have now been talking more about private education, particularly Christian school, and then we started to meet and understand more about homeschooling. I'd ask you, it's our opinion, because we're immersed in it now, that this is very mainstream. I don't know if that's accurate or not. It feels to us now normal. It always was, of course, normal. I don't mean to sound like I'm literally disparaging it, but you understand that it's kind of like Dave Ramsey on finances. Be weird, live debt free. Similarly, I think many parents who homeschooled always knew it was the best route for their families, but many outsiders thought them weird. Odd, right? And I don't know that that's so much the case today. Maybe that's changing.
I think you're right. What the COVID experience did for many families, I think, is, homeschooling had moved from viewed as the fringe, then it became kind of a powerful social movement where it was an instrument of pretty major change in our society, kind of wresting control of education of children away from the state bureaucracy and taking charge back in the family and the church. And COVID, many families going into COVID who would never have thought about homeschooling. Maybe they didn't think it was terrible, and maybe they knew homeschooling families and they thought it was okay, but they would never have thought themselves as homeschoolers. And then they experienced, what was going on in the public schools through the Zoom window.
Yeah.
Right.
They experienced having their kids at home. They began, more people were working remotely and their kids were home with them. A guy I know, he's a professor of psychology, and he kind of comes at this more from a secular viewpoint, but he blogs, and he did a lot of studies during COVID. And one of the things he learned was that families, it didn't just benefit, it benefited families who are kind of, high achieving families whose kids, get up, rush to the bus,
right.
After school, you've got to do your sport and then your other society and then home and do homework and, dance lessons and running everywhere. And they stopped during that time.
Right.
They took a pause and they learned that they really liked being with each other, and that slowed down. And so a lot of people who would never have thought of themselves as homeschoolers experienced it themselves, kind of not voluntarily, and liked it and have stuck with it.
Which is, I think that piece is amazing too, because I also watched from the other end with COVID with a lot of my friends and people I knew saying, oh, well, here we go, we're homeschooling, where the teacher was providing all the material. They were just watching it on a computer and I laughed and I thought, like, you are not even remotely homeschooling. But like, to your point, you are seeing the fact that, wow, we don't have to rush out of bed if we don't want to. And, there's flexibility. I think people enjoyed the flexibility angle a lot, even though they were not technically homeschooling at that point. They were just teaching public school at home. And so there was a big difference.
But it's like a taste. People got a taste.
Yes.
And,
Sure.
And because there are lots of homeschoolers today, then they may have taken the next step. And the other big thing that I think has changed for our society is because of that experience, and for the next generation, really, people who have gone through that experience will be less reluctant to make the change, even if they went back to public schools.
We talk about that a lot.
Right. So the public
Yes.
schools of today are a lot more ideologically driven in ways that many people find difficult to navigate. And now they know. They have actually real live personal experience of what it would be like to have their kids at home. Much easier to make that decision today if the schools aren't.
Right. You can change it up if it's not working.
And it was almost culturally like, I still can't get over the fact that this COVID era was like a cultural accelerant. It made, as you say, public schools seemed to just lean hard into progressivism, whereas people became more entrenched as parents to say, I'm taking control back. I've never seen such a bright white line drawn as I saw here in the last few years. Yes?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
So your website that you have, I have been on there looking around, and one thing that I really think is important, again, just talking to people across the country about homeschooling, is the wealth of information that is on there. What would you say to somebody as a new family? I'm a new mom to homeschooling. I don't know where to start. I want to know that I'm protecting myself, number one, but I also want to know that I'm doing what I need to be doing for my family. Where on you, that's because you have a lot on the website, which I think is tremendous. Where do you recommend somebody go in and just start? Where do they start? Where do they begin?
Well, our name is Homeschool Legal Defense Association, so we have a lot of good information on how you can comply with your law in your state. And this is sort of a corollary to what we were just talking about, people who were home during COVID and decided to homeschool and just kind of thought you could just start homeschooling.
Right.
But there are actually 50 states, and they have, there are 50 state laws, and they're different. Each of the states has a different law, and so you do need to know what the legal requirements are in your state. They're a lot less onerous and difficult to comply with today, but our website is just chock full of how you can start your homeschool legally. And then, I would say the second thing to do is to find other homeschoolers and groups of people who are already doing it and plug into a community. Because one of the things that homeschooling parents and moms especially, I think, need to know is you can do this.
Right.
Right. And being with others who have chosen and are doing it, know how to do it, help you have the confidence to really step into it. That's a big thing. And know that you don't have to do school, public school at home. If you have 3 children of school age, I have 7 kids, and I can tell you for sure that they have different personalities and different learning styles and different desires, different interests. You can actually accommodate each of your children in a way that's best suited for them. So some children learn better by reading, some by hearing, some by using their hands.
Sure.
Some kids have interests in, they get really interested in arts or in homeschool kids start their own businesses at an early age.
Heard a lot of that.
There's so don't fall into the trap of thinking you have to start at 8:30 and have English and Spanish and go right down through the day.
And that brings me to what would be, I guess, the more it's not contentious. It's not contentious to us. It's not contentious to the Herzog
Probably
Foundation.
not to a lot of
and I don't
listeners
think
either.
Most.
No.
We have great friends. Our daughter's in private Christian school. We have great friends who homeschool. But you know this better than most. And given the history that you shared with us, I think it's important for everyone to understand that this now makes sense to me, maybe more than it used to. Why there may be conflict of interest sometimes in what's known as school choice movement politically, and homeschoolers who are very mistrustful of it. And I wonder if that
clearly for good reason.
For good reason. Does that stem from this 40-year fight that you've been engaged in, do you think?
I think in part that's true. I've written a piece called The Civic Virtue of Private Homeschooling, or how I came to, my subtitle is, I can't come up with it. The Civic Virtue of Private Homeschooling. You can look it up. And I try to give a reasoned approach to why I and my organization oppose public funding for homeschoolers. And it's partly that with the money will come rules that we fought for 40 years to move back the boundaries of regulation in more towards liberty. And, public funding is very likely to bring more regulation back. But we also go back to a more principled, I try to express a more principled reason. Education really isn't a function of the state. Education is really a function of the family. Parents, children are given to parents in the family by God, and it's our duty as parents to make sure that they're raised in the nurture and admonition of the Lord and prepared to be self-sufficient, contributing citizens in our nation. And so when you begin with that premise, if you start that education is a state function, you end up with regulation. And so the school choice proponents, many of my friends in that movement, think that, well, everybody is paying taxes, so everybody should get money. But if you start for the premise that it's really not the right place, that it's really parents and families that should be doing it, then you wouldn't want this state oversight or the state involvement. And there's a whole historical, the progressive movement back in the late 19th century kind of displaced private charity with public bureaucracy. And Milton Friedman, who is considered to be the father of educational choice and vouchers or educational savings accounts, in his book, Free to Choose, actually says that before that era, people were better educated, more literate, before compulsory education came along, and before public funding of education came along. And so he is, from an economist standpoint, wants to take a step back from kind of the full-on socialist view of education, where you have to go to the public school and the state is the provider of everything, to let's just be funders of education. So from a socialist to a social welfare model. And I think it should go the next step to be a liberty model based on biblical and kind of natural law principles.
I love it and completely agree with you. And I spend a lot of time off of this show talking about politics, and this subject comes up quite a bit. And what you've just laid out very well, I understand completely. Would your position be each state's capital, each state's legislature allocates so many dollars per student per year in each state, and that comes from taxpayers? Would your position be that model go away entirely? There is no tax collected. There is no state funding or distribution of education. If you had a perfect world,
yeah. So that's a If you went back to the really principled foundational thinking about how education should work, it should be in the families and it should be privately funded. And foundations like the Herzog Foundation really would spring up to help families who couldn't sustain a private education themselves. And that's really what was displaced through that first progressive era was, we started looking to the state instead of to each other.
Right.
And the really genius of homeschooling, why I call it the civic virtue of private homeschooling, is homeschoolers came together in a new way and said, we typically would go to state legislatures and say, we don't want to hand out. We just want you to keep your hands off. And we'll take care of it privately in reliance on each other. And we have succeeded. The homeschooling movement today is
clearly
successful.
Right.
Yeah.
And is really more of an enduring institution. It went from being a fringe to a movement to a successful movement, which is now an enduring institution that can really shape the culture.
I was going to, I would see it going even further, where I think it's really upending what is happening in public education because of the exodus that is happening in a lot of areas is forcing education to rethink.
It threatens education establishment. It threatens teachers' unions. We know that. And I get hung up on the fact that all of us pay taxes, right? We pay taxes for this thing in our community.
That we don't, right.
Would it, I go back to this again because here's my position. I'll say, I don't disagree with your position, but I would much prefer then we be able to keep more of the money we're paying to the legislature to spend on our own children's educational needs, right?
Yeah, and that's so there's a distinction between, so this is how taxes work, right? Yeah. So this is the libertarian in me coming out. Yeah. I have money. And the people in the State House say, we need your money to help those people. So they, if I don't give them my money to help those people, men with guns come to my house and take that money and give those people. All right, that's
That's your property.
That's right. And so if the legislature were to say, we value what you're doing, educating your own children, so we're going to let you keep more of your money through tax credits or other vehicles. We're not going to take it in the first place. You take care of you want to take care of your own education of your own children, you keep your own money, rather than us take $1, cycle it through our bureaucracy, and then distribute 50 cents to somebody else.
Okay. So I'm sorry to continue to hammer this. It's just to be clear, there would be no money leaving my pocket going to the legislature coming back to me in Jim's perfect world.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, it's easy enough to understand. And again, the belief being that even through tax credits from the state, that is a worry that would mean they would have some kind of potential role in your home education.
Well, tax credits we do support.
You do.
A tax credit that allows me to keep more of my own money. So, like the child tax credit. So families with children who earn certain amounts of income, keeping more of their own money, we support that sort of an approach.
So, for instance, what Kim Reynolds has done in Iowa or Sarah Sanders in Arkansas, is that, forgive my ignorance, maybe I don't understand the metrics, is that not effectively a tax credit?
I don't believe so, no.
There's a physical transference of funds?
Right.
Okay.
Because it goes one place,
Right.
circles back, like you said, not
Right.
just
Well, that seems like an
holding
easy
it.
needle to thread then. I guess I need to spend some more time thinking about this, because to me it would seem easy for a legislature to say, we'll just let you write this off come tax time or something.
It is easy to do. So, you have to understand, though, that Milton Friedman won the Nobel Prize for economics. He's you're talking to Jim Mason, I have not won any Nobel Prizes. And so he's the father of school choice, and they've been working on this for, decades.
Right.
Yeah.
He first started propounding this notion, again, from an economic standpoint. He comes from an economic standpoint, not from a natural law standpoint.
Sure.
So from an economic standpoint, since the 1950s, and so this is interesting historically, at about the same time that Jimmy Carter was creating the Department of Education and homeschooling was getting off the ground, Milton and Rose Friedman published Free to Choose. Okay. And there was a very influential public broadcasting show about how to, not just in education, but in all aspects of American life, how to get the government kind of out of our lives. And that was really the big splashy entrance of school choice through vouchers, which then became the Milton and Rose Friedman Foundation, which is now Ed Choice. So they've been working at this for a very long time. And just like homeschoolers, COVID gave them a huge opportunity to change people's minds in the legislatures too.
Yes.
Absolutely.
It's so important to understand, one, the history. Two, I think I'll close by asking you this, because I know you've got to run. You've been generous with your time today, Jim. Do you think private Christian education, whether it's done at home or private Christian schools, I know your preference would be, and the HSLDA preference would be to have children taught in the home.
Right.
But I like to dispatch with the myth that we're really at odds, those of us who would advocate for Christian schools or homeschooling. I feel like there's much more that binds us in common than not.
Yeah, and I would like to dispel that notion too. So, when you go back to my biblical and natural law foundations, the Bible places the jurisdiction of the education of children in the family and the church. And, out of that arises the notion that parents have natural rights to direct the education of their children. It's not my business to tell other parents how to do that. I choose home education.
Sure.
Others in your family, you choose private Christian schools. That's your job to decide that. We just think that the parents ought to be the ones deciding it.
Making that choice instead.
It's the parents who, the Lord has charged with making sure their children are raised and nurtured, not Jim Mason, not HSLDA, and certainly not, the Department of Education in Washington, D.C.
This was one of our favorite conversations, I guarantee, right? I hope that everyone will seek out, those of you who are already homeschooling or considering homeschooling, this is an absolute must visit, the HSLDA, the website hslda.org, which we will put in our show notes.
For sure.
Jim, this is I know you've traveled to come here to the Herzog Foundation. I guess I'd ask you, just generally speaking, what's your impression of the foundation? And I'll let you run. I know I already said I'd let you run, but I'll ask you in closing.
Well, I think it's a wonderful opportunity for Christian education in America. I became acquainted with Daryl in September.
President.
He was a guest at Sorry.
No, that's right.
Okay. We've mentioned.
He was a guest at our National Leaders Conference in North Carolina in September. And he gave me a kind of a rundown of what you guys are doing here. And I just support it wholeheartedly. You have a wonderful campus here. And the work you're doing is really, really important. So God bless you all. I mean, I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to come out here and chat with you guys.
We feel the same.
We're thrilled.
Any organization that has written, the Washington Post has written countless exposés and pages on in the last year. I have
feel like
never
we can
seen.
get behind.
I've never seen the Washington Post so obsessed with the subject of homeschooling. Have you? I think they've done 3 this year.
They're working on a 4th. I'm actually going to be meeting with the reporter next week.
Oh, well, we'll watch.
God
for
bless,
that.
we'll pray. I hope they'll
Yes.
give you a fair hearing. They seem uniquely consumed with it. And they seem hostile to it. That's my read on it. But I don't know. Maybe you're going to try to change their mind a bit.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting time in our country because things have changed so much. We've talked about this a little bit. They are recognizing, I think this Washington Post reporter and others in the more popular media are recognizing that homeschooling is here to stay. It's a force. It's a force.
And only growing.
And it's only growing. And so while some of the treatments are negative, it begins with the premise that we're here to stay.
Yes.
We're an enduring institution. And, they're treating us that way, even with a little bit of hostility.
Yeah.
Yes. In fact, they even acknowledged that the fastest growth, we talked about this on a previous show, is
yeah.
New York. New York City.
Which is amazing to me and
Mind-blowing.
not what I would have expected.
All right, we could keep you here forever. We're not going to do it anymore. Jim Mason, thank you so much.
Thank you
for your
so
time.
much for taking your time
Well,
today.
thank you. It's been my pleasure.
And next week, we'll be back with more episodes. Thank you so much for checking in, and we'll see you here again soon.
Making the Leap is a podcast presentation courtesy of the Herzog Foundation. Please rate and comment on the show, as well as subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we'll see you next time on Making the Leap.